Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. You might not have gone far, and that's just because I ultimately decided that I wanted to film both the intro and this video today, just because I think that the intro might have felt kind of fruitless if that's all that you had gotten. So I wanted to just go ahead and provide the first bit of content, that way you can tune in next Sunday and we can just keep things pushing right along. I broke these two videos up because this one will definitely be one of the longer ones in my series, so forewarning on that. But today I'll be covering what is racism. So I'll start by providing a definition of racism, and then I'll show you what it looks like to see racism at the micro level, which is person to person, at the meso level, which is the community, and then finally the institutional level, aka the macro level. So let's jump in. So first, I'm providing a definition of racism because, as you can tell from a quick Google search, there's not one standard definition of what it is. This is actually why I think a lot of people run into issues when trying to discuss and learn about these topics, because any two people might not have the same fundamental idea of what racism is. Of course, that doesn't mean that the definition I'm providing today is the definition. I'm just providing it so that as you go through this series, you can understand the framework that I'm operating from. So that framework or definition that I'll be using comes from Dr. Stephen Roberts, who's a social psychologist and one of my all-time favorite professors. The absolute king, known as Dr. Roberts, was recently featured in an article in which he explains his definition and how racism in America operates. I'll be linking that article down below, but I thought that this quote, which Stanford used when tweeting about the article, was a really good way to sum up the definition that I use. It says, "People often define racism as disliking or mistreating others on the basis of race. That definition is wrong. Racism is a system of advantage based on race. It is a hierarchy. It is a pandemic." That's why at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that I'd be discussing racism on the micro, meso, and macro levels. That's because racism is a system that's composed of these parts. So without further ado, let's jump into the micro level. So I didn't mention this at the very beginning of the video when I laid out what I was going to cover, but I'll be discussing the micro level in two ways. The first is going to be some of the internal biological processes that underlie prejudice, because that's kind of my major. And then the second will be the ways in which you might commit microaggressions because of these prejudices. So clearly prejudice is a huge part of the puzzle, and I promise I'm going to stop saying prejudice soon. So let's start with a quick rundown of prejudice versus racism. Prejudice, according to Google, is a preconceived opinion not based on reason or experience. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of that definition just because I think that some people's prejudices can be reinforced by a single bad experience that they've had with a person of color or a Black person, so I really want to focus on the fact that it's an opinion not based on reason. However, I will say that when I say reinforce, you can only reinforce something that's already there. Anywho, it is these opinions which make up actions at the micro, meso, and macro levels of society which harm Black individuals and ultimately set up the system that we know as racism. So basically, prejudice is just one little piece of this big racist picture. So what makes prejudice unreasonable, and how does it exist before ever having had a negative experience with a Black person? This is where we get into the biological processes that underlie prejudice. There are regions in the brain associated with fear and recognizing human faces. They're called the amygdala and the fusiform cortex, and obviously you don't need to know those, but they're particularly relevant when discussing the biology of prejudice. Since we became humans way back when, we started categorizing other people to recognize who's in our in-group and who's in our out-group. It was a survival tactic. Now, those tactics aren't entirely necessary, but our brain still does this categorization, and there's evidence that this starts around 6 months, and then children have solidified their in and out groups by around 5 or 6. What that means is when we see people of another race, our amygdala activates and we automatically have a fear response without even knowing it. Additionally, the region of our brain that's associated with recognizing human faces doesn't light up as quickly. There's a delay. So for a very brief moment, you're technically not seeing a person of another race or your outgroup as human. I'll be linking some fairly accessible articles written by Dr. Robert Sapolsky down below that explain this in further detail. Now, I don't want to make racism sound natural or hopeless because it's not. Different people have different activation patterns in these brain regions. For example, people raised in mixed race environments can shut off this fear response much quicker than a person raised in a racially homogeneous or racially similar environment. This is because of a phenomenon known as perceptual narrowing, which, as I mentioned before, starts around 6 months. Perceptual narrowing is a phenomenon in which children become less able to distinguish between faces of other race people over time. For example, a white child raised in a predominantly white environment will be able to distinguish between faces of white people much easier than they can distinguish between faces of Black people. This might sound minor, but it's a perfect segue into my next section, in which I'll be discussing racism at the micro level and giving examples of that. I'll start discussing examples by talking about something that Dr. Roberts said in the article, which demonstrates the consequences of perceptual narrowing. Suppose you have a white woman that was raised in a predominantly white environment, and she claims that she saw a Black man robbing her house. In fact, she saw him running out of her house when she arrived home, so the police later asked her to identify this Black man in a lineup. She misidentifies the person who committed the crime and puts an innocent Black man in jail. This is just one example of what racism at the micro, so person-to-person level, can look like. Some other examples that are a little less intense might include clutching your bag when you see a Black person, staring at or even following Black people in stores because you think they're going to steal, or even crossing the road when you see a Black person approaching. These are all examples of what racism looks like at the micro level, and it demonstrates what this fear response that activates automatically looks like in real time. The micro level section was the bulk of this video, so yay for making it this far. That's kind of me cheering myself on because I'm really tired. But next I'll just give some examples of what racism looks like at the meso level. At the community level, racism looks like over-policing of POC neighborhoods or even gentrification. So let's start with over-policing. A common talking point that folks often use to justify their prejudices or racist remarks regarding policing in POC neighborhoods is that POC neighborhoods need more policing because there's more crime there. However, that's kind of a chicken and an egg situation. It's actually likely that police being more present in these neighborhoods leads to what looks like disproportionate amount of crime taking place. They're just there to document it more often, and they're much more likely to investigate a POC perpetrator than a white perpetrator, even in something as minor as a traffic stop. In fact, crime is more closely related and associated with poverty because economic disparities, which are very prevalent in the United States, are a driving force for crime. Rather than taking it out on rich people, poor people are more often to take out these aggressions that stem from economic disparity on other poor people. Now, gentrification is sort of close to the macro level, but the way it plays out at the meso level is when, for example, young, white, affluent people start moving into a predominantly POC neighborhood that's being revamped and has cheaper real estate, and they drive up the rent by buying up the properties in that area until POC people have no choice but to move out of these places that they've been renting from for years. What might seem harmless to a young, eager homeowner is actually deliberate violence against POC people, which brings me to macro level racism. There are a ton of examples that I could give for macro level racism, but let's just start with some bases that we've already covered. Like, why are POC people renting instead of buying homes in these neighborhoods? Or what happened to that hypothetical Black man that we put in prison? POC people are more often renters than homeowners compared to white people, and this can be attributed to macro institutional level racism. Historical policies such as redlining, which kept Black people from purchasing homes in certain white neighborhoods, meant that Black people were less likely to purchase these homes and build up generational wealth and security that comes from that. This still has consequences today, regardless of any policies in place to protect Black buyers from discrimination. Think about it this way. Even if you're an I pulled myself up by the bootstraps kind of gal, think of all the resources that you'll be able to give your children and how much those resources are going to help them. Black people, in one way or another, have been barred from these opportunities for 400 years, and as you'll see over the course of this series, are still barred from several opportunities. That's how racism is a system of advantage and a hierarchy. Or better said, that's how racism is a system that's constantly meant to disadvantage Black people whenever and wherever possible. To wrap up, I've decided I'm going to skip over the Black man in prison hypothetical. That's just because I think that those consequences of that type of institutional racism are a bit more obvious in terms of losing voting rights or the right to purchase a firearm, things like that. That's not to disregard their importance. It's something that I really, really care about, but I'll be discussing it more in the future, which is why I'm dropping it now. Instead, I'm going to provide an example that shows how micro, meso, and macro level racism all come together and play out when it comes to Black women seeking help in the medical field. There are studies that show that doctors believe and are even taught that Black people experience pain less than people of other races. This leads to disproportionately negative health outcomes in Black people seeking medical care, especially pregnant Black women. The mortality rate in childbirth for Black women is much higher than that for white women, like 2 to 3 times higher. And you can see why when you know that their health concerns aren't taken seriously by medical professionals. This shows how doctors influenced by meso-level med school training take these prejudices into micro-level patient-doctor interactions and cause the high rate of Black women dying in childbirth, which is an institutional medical field problem. I hope that that example kind of demonstrated to you the way that all of these things tie together and what this looks like at a systemic level. I hope that you now understand how racism is a system of hierarchy and advantage, and I hope that you'll tune in next Sunday where I'll be talking about how everyone is racist. Everyone. But like, comment, share, and subscribe. And of course, if you have any questions or topics that you'd like me to cover in the future, please comment them down below. Bye!